world's most sensitive maritime choke point is suddenly back at the center of a fast-moving confrontation, and the timing could not be more dangerous. U.S. Navy destroyers have moved into and around the Strait of Hormuz as tensions spike across the Gulf, with shipping security once again becoming a live question for global energy markets. At the same time, diplomatic channels meant to keep the region from tipping into open conflict are showing signs of strain, with talks involving Iran appearing to stall. And on Israel's northern front, the fighting posture is hardening, with the Israeli military intensifying pressure on Hezbollah as cross-border fire and threats continue to escalate. This is not one isolated crisis. It's a set of linked flashpoints, sea lanes, diplomacy, and the Israel-Lebanon frontier, each capable of triggering the other. And the speed at which these pieces are moving is what's alarming. A naval posture shift in the Gulf, a breakdown in political communication, and a tightening military campaign in the north. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, crowded, and strategically unforgiving. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil consumption moves through this corridor in normal conditions, along with major volumes of liquefied natural gas. That makes it a magnet for brinkmanship. Even small incidents, an intercepted drone, a boarded tanker, a misread radar track, can cascade into something much larger. Now, U.S. destroyers are operating in that environment again, the kind of presence meant to deter interference with commercial shipping and reassure partners, but also the kind of move that can be interpreted by Tehran as pressure or provocation, depending on the moment. The U.S. has long maintained naval forces in the region, but the immediate context matters. This surge in attention comes as regional tensions are already high and as Iran's relationships with U.S. allies in the Gulf remain complex and brittle. In practical terms, destroyers in or near the strait are multi-mission platforms. They can escort shipping, monitor airspace, track missiles, and respond quickly to harassment at sea. They are also a signal and unambiguous reminder that Washington is prepared to defend navigation routes that are critical to global trade. But deterrence at sea is never just about hardware. It's about intent, communication, and what each side believes the other might do next. The danger is that the Gulf has a long history of incidents that start small and become politically impossible to ignore. Recent years have seen repeated episodes of tanker seizures, attempted seizures, and harassment in and around the Gulf, often tied to broader disputes, sanctions enforcement, regional proxy conflicts, and retaliatory messaging. Shipping companies already operating with heightened security protocols tend to react quickly, rerouting where possible, raising insurance costs, and pressing navies for escorts or protective patrols. Markets react too, even to the possibility of disruption, because Hormuz is not easily replaced. There is no quick alternative route for the same scale of energy flow. Against that backdrop, the other major threat is diplomatic. Talks involving Iran appear to be collapsing, or at minimum hitting a point where progress is no longer visible. When diplomacy stalls, the region tends to default to pressure, signaling, and counter-signaling. And when that happens at the same time as naval deployments, the risk of miscalculation rises. Iran's leadership has repeatedly framed U.S. naval activity in the region as part of a broader campaign of coercion. Washington, for its part, frames its posture as defensive, protecting freedom of navigation and safeguarding international commerce. Those two narratives can coexist for years, but they become combustible when paired with a specific incident: a drone shot down, a ship boarded, a missile test, a strike by a proxy militia. And that brings us to the third linked front, Israel's northern border, where the conflict with Hezbollah has been intensifying. Since the war in Gaza began, the Israel-Lebanon frontier has seen airstrikes and artillery. Entire communities on both sides have faced displacement, with civilians paying the price for a conflict that is increasingly normalized as routine despite its constant potential to expand. Israel's military posture in the north has shifted toward heavier, more sustained pressure, what can be described as tightening the screws, striking deeper, targeting infrastructure and commanders, and trying to impose costs that deter further attacks. Hezbollah, meanwhile, has signaled it will continue operations as long as the Gaza war continues, positioning its fire as linked to the border confrontation. The immediate concern is that the northern front is one of the most likely places for escalation to spiral quickly. Hezbollah's arsenal is large and varied, and Israel's response capabilities are overwhelming. A single mass casualty strike, a successful hit on a strategic facility, or a misread warning could trigger an escalation ladder that neither side can easily step down from once it starts. And here's where all three stories connect. If the northern front expands into a wider regional war, the Gulf becomes more volatile. If the Gulf becomes more volatile, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a pressure point. If Hormuz becomes a pressure point, international navies surge and diplomatic channels become even more critical, yet those channels are the ones now appearing to fray. In the Gulf, there's also the matter of partners and proxies. Iran's network of aligned armed groups across the region has played a major role in shaping the security environment from Iraq and Syria to Yemen and beyond. Even if Tehran is not directly ordering every action, it benefits strategically from the pressure those groups can apply, and it also bears the risk that one of them triggers a crisis Tehran didn't intend. For shipping, the threat environment is not theoretical. The Red Sea has already seen significant disruption in recent months due to attacks on commercial vessels, forcing reroutes around Africa that add time and cost. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes similarly unstable, the global economy would face another shock on top of existing strain. That's why destroyer movements matter. Navies are trying to prevent the Gulf from becoming the next major maritime crisis zone. At the same time, the collapse of talks with Iran, whether formal negotiations or indirect understandings, removes a safety valve. Even limited communication can reduce the risk of accidental escalation. Without it, both sides rely more heavily on signals, and signals can be misread. Meanwhile, on Israel's northern front, the fighting is increasingly described in terms of objectives, pushing Hezbollah away from the border, reducing the threat to northern Israeli communities, and restoring a sense of security that has been badly shaken. Hezbollah frames its actions as resistance and as leverage tied to Gaza. The result is a standoff where each side claims deterrence, but both sides keep firing. In that environment, siege becomes an expression of strategy, tightening constraints, targeting supply lines, degrading command and control, and trying to limit an opponent's freedom of movement. Israel has shown a willingness to strike across Lebanon, while Hezbollah has demonstrated the capability to hit targets across northern Israel. The danger is that the battlefield becomes less constrained by geography and more defined by capability. And there's a political layer, too. Regional leaders are managing domestic pressures, alliance expectations, and the fear of looking weak. That can make compromise harder. It can also make escalation more tempting if leaders believe a show of force is needed to maintain credibility. On the U.S. side, naval deployments are also shaped by broader commitments, protecting allies, maintaining the credibility of deterrence, and preventing a regional war that could draw in American forces. The U.S. has repeatedly stated it does not seek war with Iran, but it will defend its forces and interests. In the Gulf, that translates into readiness and presence. But presence has a cost. The more assets are concentrated in a tight space, the more opportunities there are for close encounters, fast boats approaching, aircraft shadowing, drones overhead. Each interaction becomes a moment where discipline and communication matter. In Israel and Lebanon, the cost is human and immediate. Border towns are emptied, infrastructure is hit, and fear becomes a daily condition. The longer this continues, the more difficult it becomes to return to an earlier status quo because the damage accumulates and the political demands for decisive action grow louder. And yet the region has seen this pattern before. Quiet diplomacy fails, military pressure rises, maritime routes become contested, and then everyone scrambles to prevent the final step into a wider war. The problem is that scrambling often happens after an incident, not before. Right now, the warning signs are visible. American destroyers moving through one of the world's most contested waterways, Iran-linked diplomacy appearing to stall, and Israel's northern campaign tightening against Hezbollah. Each is serious on its own. Together, they create a web of risk. The question is not whether any side wants a full-scale regional war. The question is whether the region can avoid stumbling into one through miscalculation, retaliation, and the momentum of events. In the next part, we'll look more closely at what the naval movements mean in operational terms, what the breakdown in talks suggests about the next phase of pressure, and how the northern front could shift from sustained exchanges into something far larger, fast. What happens next will likely be decided less by grand declarations and more by small, fast-moving encounters, radar locks, warning calls on maritime channels, drones approaching too close, a single rocket that lands in the wrong place. With U.S. destroyers operating in and around the Strait of Hormuz, diplomacy with Iran reportedly faltering, and Israel tightening its posture against Hezbollah, the region is sitting on a three-way trigger: sea lanes, state-to-state messaging, and a border front where miscalculation has a long history of turning into something bigger. The Strait of Hormuz remains the most unforgiving geography in the global energy system. It is narrow, crowded, and constantly watched. Commercial tankers, naval patrols, and surveillance aircraft all operate in a space where minutes matter and intentions are often inferred rather than confirmed. The strategic reality has not changed. A significant share of globally traded oil and major volumes of liquefied natural gas transit this corridor. That concentration creates a paradox. Because the waterway is so essential, everyone has incentives to avoid a full closure. But because it is so essential, even limited disruption can ripple instantly through markets and politics, and that makes brinkmanship tempting. The U.S. naval presence is designed to deter interference with commercial shipping and to reassure partners that the sea lane will remain open, yet deterrence is never interpreted in a vacuum. In Tehran, additional U.S. maritime activity can be read as a warning, a pressure tactic, or the opening phase of a broader campaign, depending on what else is happening at the same time, including sanctions enforcement, regional proxy activity, and the status of back-channel communications. In Washington and allied capitals, the same deployments are framed as defensive and stabilizing. The problem is that both readings can be true at once, and the gap between them is where incidents are born. What makes this moment especially dangerous is the overlap of arenas. Maritime tension does not stay maritime. Iran has multiple ways to respond without directly engaging U.S. ships: harassment of commercial vessels by small craft, drone activity around shipping lanes, cyber operations against port infrastructure, or calibrated moves by aligned militias elsewhere in the region. Conversely, a maritime incident can change calculations on land. If Tehran feels cornered at sea, it may seek leverage by raising pressure through partners and allies. If Israel believes Iran is escalating indirectly, it may decide to intensify actions against Iranian-linked networks in Syria, Lebanon, or beyond. Each move can be framed as defensive, but the cumulative effect is escalation. That is why the reported strain in Iran-related talks matters as much as the destroyers themselves. Even limited diplomacy, technical meetings, indirect messages, third-party mediation functions like a circuit breaker. It does not solve the underlying conflict, but it provides a way to clarify intent and reduce the chance that an accident becomes a deliberate clash. When those channels stall, the region becomes more dependent on deterrence alone. And deterrence without communication is brittle. It can hold until it doesn't. There's also a domestic political layer that often gets overlooked. In the United States, the threshold for tolerating attacks on shipping or U.S. forces is shaped by public perception and by the broader global context. In Iran, leadership must balance external pressure with internal legitimacy, and it has historically used resistance narratives to maintain cohesion. In Israel, the Northern Front is tightly linked to public expectations about security and deterrence after months of regional volatility. None of these governments wants a wider war. But each faces incentives to avoid looking weak. That is a classic setup for escalation driven by reputation rather than strategy. On Israel's northern front, the pressure campaign against Hezbollah is part of a familiar pattern, but the current environment is unusually combustible. Cross-border fire, retaliatory strikes, and the steady movement of forces all create a sense of inevitability that can become self-fulfilling. The more each side mobilizes and signals readiness, the more likely it is that one side misreads the other's red lines. Hezbollah's posture is shaped by its identity as both a Lebanese political actor and an Iranian-aligned armed force. It calibrates its actions not only to Israel's moves, but to Tehran's regional strategy and the mood of its own constituency. Israel, for its part, must weigh the cost of a major northern war against the cost of prolonged displacement and insecurity in its border communities. The word siege is emotionally loaded, but it captures a real, dynamic, sustained pressure designed to constrict an adversary's freedom of action. In practice, that can include targeting launch sites, command nodes, supply routes, and surveillance assets, while also signaling that deeper strikes are possible. The risk is that sustained pressure can push the adversary toward a dramatic response designed to restore deterrence. If Hezbollah believes it is being strategically squeezed, it may feel compelled to demonstrate that it can still impose costs through a high-profile strike, a more sophisticated weapon, or a broader volley. Israel would almost certainly respond forcefully. The latter can be climbed quickly. Here is where the three flashpoints connect. If the Israel-Hezbollah track escalates sharply, Iran may feel pressure to show support directly or indirectly. That could translate into increased maritime risk in the Gulf, even if Iran avoids direct confrontation. Alternatively, a maritime incident in Hormuz could harden Israel's threat perception and accelerate its willingness to strike Iranian-linked assets in the region. Meanwhile, the collapse of talks removes the off-ramps that might otherwise slow the chain reaction. The most plausible near-term scenario is not a single dramatic event, but a sequence of smaller ones. A commercial ship reports harassment, insurance rates spike, a drone is intercepted, a militia attack occurs elsewhere, Israel responds, Hezbollah answers, and suddenly multiple fronts are
active. In such a sequence, each actor can claim it is responding to the previous step, even as the overall direction is toward escalation. Energy markets are often the first to react, and not always rationally. Risk premiums rise on the mere possibility of disruption. Shipping companies adjust routes or slow-roll transits while waiting for naval escorts or updated threat assessments. Insurers raise rates.
Importers seek alternative supplies. Even if the strait remains open, the perception of danger can tighten global supply conditions. That can feed back into politics far from the region as governments face higher fuel prices and inflationary pressure. In other words, a confrontation in a narrow channel can become a global story within hours. The military reality in Hormuz is also more complex than the headline of destroyers entering. Modern naval operations there involve layered surveillance, electronic warfare, drones, aircraft, and allied coordination. The objective is often to create a clear picture of the environment and to be able to react quickly to ambiguous threats. But ambiguity is exactly what adversaries exploit. A small, fast boat can look like a fishing vessel until it doesn't. A drone can be commercial until it isn't. A radar track can be misidentified. The tighter the space, the less time there is to verify. Rules of engagement are designed to manage this, but they cannot eliminate human judgment under pressure. A warning shot, a maneuver to block, or a sudden acceleration can be interpreted as hostile. Once weapons are fired, whether intentionally or accidentally, leaders may feel they have no choice but to respond. That is why deconfliction channels matter. If those channels are weak or absent, the risk goes up sharply. The diplomatic dimension is equally fragile. When talks stall, the reasons can range from substantive disagreements to tactical pauses to internal politics on either side. But the effect is similar. Fewer opportunities to clarify red lines, fewer ways to trade concessions, and fewer mechanisms to prevent a crisis from becoming a war. In the past, even adversaries with deep hostility have relied on indirect communication to manage risk. When that mechanism breaks down, militaries become the primary messengers, and military messages are, by nature, blunt. If there is a single strategic question underlying all of this, it is whether the region is entering a phase where deterrence is being tested simultaneously on multiple fronts. Testing deterrence is not always about launching an all-out attack. It can be about probing, seeing how quickly a Navy responds, how consistently it escorts shipping, whether a strike triggers retaliation, whether a diplomatic warning is followed by action. Probing can be incremental, but incremental probing can still produce an accident. Israel's calculus on Hezbollah is shaped by the belief that prolonged low-level conflict on the border is unsustainable. Hezbollah's calculus is shaped by the belief that it can impose costs while staying below the threshold of full war. Those two beliefs can coexist for a time until one side decides the other has crossed a line. The longer the standoff lasts, the higher the chance that a single incident becomes the turning point, especially if either side believes the strategic environment is changing elsewhere, such as in the Gulf. So what would de-escalation look like in practical terms? It would not require trust. It would require predictable behavior and restored communication. In the Gulf, that means clear signaling about escort operations, visible commitment to protecting commercial traffic, and avoidance of unnecessary provocations close to Iranian territorial waters. It also means using intermediaries, regional states, European channels, or other backdoor lines to keep messages moving even when formal talks are stuck. On the Israel-Lebanon front, de-escalation would mean reducing the tempo of strikes and fire, creating space for third-party mediation, and setting clearer boundaries about what triggers major retaliation. But the reality is that none of these steps happens in isolation. A de-escalatory move by one actor can be interpreted as weakness by another. That is why coordination among allies matters and why messaging must be consistent. If partners send mixed signals, one pushing restraint, another hinting at escalation, the adversary will choose the interpretation that best fits its narrative. The next days and weeks will likely be defined by whether the region can keep these flashpoints compartmentalized, if maritime tension stays maritime, if the Israel-Hezbollah confrontation stays below the threshold of major war, and if some form of diplomatic contact with Iran remains alive, even quietly, the system can hold. If any one of those compartments breaks, the others may follow. The most sobering lesson from past crises in this region is that the spark is often not the cause. The cause is the accumulation of pressure, the absence of trust, the presence of heavily armed forces in tight spaces, and the political need to project strength. In that environment, leaders may believe they are controlling escalation, but escalation has a way of becoming its own actor. What is unfolding is not yet a single unified war. It is a set of confrontations that can merge if mismanaged. The destroyers in Hormuz, the strain in diplomatic channels, and the hardening posture on Israel's northern border are not separate headlines. They are parts of one strategic picture, a region where deterrence is being tested, communication is thinning, and the margin for error is shrinking. The conclusion is simple and unsettling. The Strait of Hormuz can remain open and still become a crisis. Talks can be paused and still remove the guardrails. A border exchange can remain limited until the moment it isn't. This is why the current convergence matters. The danger is not only what any one actor intends to do. The danger is what happens when three volatile arenas start reacting to each other faster than diplomacy can keep up.